So, hello, thank you for coming. Welcome to the first event in our 2016 Summer Festival of Pedagogy Pop-Ups. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes approximately trying to address everything you always wanted to know about teaching pronunciation but were afraid to ask. So I'm going to cover the why, the who, the what, and the how of teaching English pronunciation based on research and based on my own classroom experience. And I can give you a list of references and things later if you want to read more and know that I'm not making it all up. So first of all, why bother teaching pronunciation at all? Well, we know from research and experience that learners of English both need and want to develop their pronunciation. So that much seems obvious. We also know that pronunciation instruction works. And there was an interesting study of studies a few years ago that showed that the effects are demonstrable in controlled contexts, so activities where learners just focus on the pronunciation and repeat, and then also to some extent in spontaneous contexts. So working on developing their pronunciation does have an effect when they're speaking spontaneously, and especially if meaning is involved. So if you're doing activities in the classroom that are meaningful, where pronouncing something in a particular way carries a meaning, you're not just playing with sound, that does have an effect. That instruction works. So we should do it. It works, right? We also know that phonological awareness has an impact on all areas. So speaking, for example, both the learner's comfort and their fluency when they're using vocabulary and grammatical structures, and there's a risk of avoidance strategies if they don't feel comfortable in using pronunciation. So it's not just about what the learners go on to do, it's also what they don't do if they don't feel comfortable with their pronunciation. We know that for listening, the flip side, good pronunciation awareness is crucial for decoding the stream of speech, recognizing what people are saying. And there's also a risk of overload if you're not confident that you've understood what's happening. It just becomes too cognitively demanding and you lose what you're listening to. So again, really important to have good awareness of sound and the sounds of speech for listening. We also know it's important for writing, and the consequences of a low phonological awareness can lead to misspelling or wild guesses at spellings. And for reading, there's research that shows that having a good phonological loop, so recognizing the representation of sounds in spelling and being able to hear them in your head when reading, makes you a better reader. So focusing on pronunciation is not just about saying words. It also affects all four skills: vocabulary, grammar, functional language, etc. And what's interesting as well with reading is that it's not necessarily important for the reader to have a native-like representation of every phoneme in their mind. What's important is that they have a distinctive enough representation to distinguish one sound from another. So related to this last point, who should teach and learn pronunciation? We've looked at why, now who? Well, I think that both learners and teachers both need to study pronunciation features in order to use them and to recognize them effectively. And both non-native and native speakers would benefit from a greater awareness of pronunciation. Because we never question the need for second language users to study pronunciation, but there are a number of features of pronunciation, especially in quick speech and especially in native accents, that can actually reduce intelligibility, their ability to be understood by different listeners. So it's quite important for anybody who uses a language to be aware of how they're using it, if it's their first or second or third or fourth or whatever language. And there's a study that's just come out this year, in fact it's not in print yet, it's only been published online, which found, and I quote, that being a non-native English-speaking teacher or native English-speaking teacher is not a critical factor in being effective pronunciation teachers. So what's important is to know what you're teaching and help your learners achieve their goals. It doesn't mean that you yourself need to have a specific accent. So we've established that it's important to teach pronunciation and that trained professionals can do it effectively, regardless of their first language. But I asked this question this morning to somebody saying, well, what do you think, what are the things you've always wanted to know about pronunciation and maybe been afraid to ask? And that person said, well, what variety should we teach? What's the right kind of pronunciation to teach? And I responded that I've lost count of how many times I've heard this question, and also how many trainee teachers have told me that they didn't feel they could teach pronunciation because they didn't have a standard accent. And I heard this quite often from people whose first language was English as well. So not only second language teacher trainees, but also native speakers. So our materials in the ELT industry are traditionally based on either received pronunciation for British English, or General American or Network American for American English. But it's estimated that only 3% of the British population even use RP. And what about other native models? What if you're from South Africa, or Ireland, or Canada, or India, or Nigeria, and your first language is English, but your first language accent is not received pronunciation? Then even saying, well, let's use a native model, it has a logic flaw. So there's 3 important facts demonstrated by research which lead me to my recommendations for what to teach. One is that the vast majority of users and teachers of English are not native speakers. Another finding from research is that accent and intelligibility, or ability to be understood, are not the same thing. So there are lots of studies that show that having a strongly identifiable regional accent is not the same as being easy or difficult to understand. They're quite separate phenomena. And thirdly, both speaker and listener have an important role to play in understanding. So it's really important to know what the context is of communication and who the listener is. And perhaps we should be focusing on understanding and not being right or good. So what things should we focus on? Well, comfortable intelligibility is this phrase that's often given as a goal. So once we've established intelligible to whom, who's the listener, then we'll probably need to focus on some segmental aspects, so individual segments, individual sounds, and the structure of a syllable, and some suprasegmental aspects. So some aspects at a higher level, things like intonation, which operates across multiple sounds, or connected speech features. And we might need to distinguish which of these are important to develop in our students' productive speech, their pronunciation, and also their listening ability. So for example, features of connected speech are not especially important, according to research, to be understood when you're speaking. However, you're probably going to hear them in other people's speech. So for listening, for that aspect of pronunciation development, really, really important to focus on. And I strongly recommend looking at the work of Richard Caldwell, who talks about listening with an interesting analogy of 3 environments: the greenhouse, the garden, and the jungle. He says the greenhouse is where we're looking at isolated words, perfectly represented in all features, nice and clean and tidy. And then the garden is where those features tend to start growing together and mixing and mingling and influencing each other. And those 2 areas are important for pronunciation, in his view. And then the jungle, which is the reality of listening, where all kinds of crazy things can happen. And you need to be prepared for that wild diversity. So finally, how to teach pronunciation and how to represent it in materials. First and foremost, integrate it with other skills, other structures, because pronunciation, as we saw, is a fundamental part of proficiency in all skills areas. Secondly, I think it's important to remember that many things in language and in life are negatively defined, by which I mean that we recognize what something is by recognizing what it isn't. So basic discrimination exercises, identifying how things are different but similar, are really important. And that means looking at things like minimal pairs. It means recognizing small distinctions between similar words or similar phrases, distinctions in sound and distinctions in meaning, which are created by those distinctions in sound. I also think that it's important to make pronunciation visual and physical, because speech uses muscles, and so it's not enough to have an abstract cognitive understanding. You need to be able to feel sound and to see sound. So encourage learners to use their eyes and their body and movement to feel how sounds change and sound patterns change. Of course, as with all skills, repeat, repeat, repeat. practice is really important and continued exposure. And in materials, research suggests that we need to make the purpose of some pronunciation practice more explicit. Because a lot of teachers and learners may not have the confidence or the background knowledge to question what is presented to them. But we know from research that it's important to question because we need to make decisions about context and listener and priorities. So by making the reasons behind our approach more explicit on the page, teachers are better equipped to make the right decisions. So to conclude, yes, some learners and some teachers may feel a little bit insecure about the way that they speak and consequently about teaching pronunciation. But if our materials and our training only ever showcase standard accents and only one or two, coupled with exercises that insist on exact replication of those models, then is it any wonder that the majority of teachers will feel insecure because they don't reflect those models? They're constantly being reminded of the fact that they don't sound like that and probably never will. So that's not very motivating for anybody. And I think, in short, as publishers, we are very well placed to highlight the reality of diverse English usage and help teachers deal with it pedagogically by giving them a range of things to focus on and the knowledge to equip them to choose which ones to focus on for their specific student. Thank you very much.